Greetings, class, and welcome to week 15, the final week before finals of 4670 network security. And this week we're going to be talking about disaster recovery and incident response. So this is one of the chapters in the book that is, again, can be seen across many different certification paths and tracks. And with the Security Plus, it kind of covers disaster recovery, incident response at a mid-level. So let's go ahead and get started. So for the Security Plus exam, one of the things that you have to look at with Chapter 12 is explain pen testing concepts, vulnerability scanning concepts, and again, they give you a lot of different scenarios with that. So we're going to cover a few things in Chapter 12 that are also widely covered in 4710, but to much more depth in that course. So this is going to be at a very high level. And again, we're going to look at forensics and look at how incident response procedures are rolled out, and then finally wrap up with disaster recovery and continuity of operation concepts. Again, this is a 50,000-foot level of these concepts and how they are employed in a business. So with penetration testing, what we're looking at doing is testing or taking a snapshot in time of an environment to see if it is susceptible to attack and gauge its vulnerability, its attack surface, and its overall security health, if you will. And it is a goal of pen testing to simulate an attack and look for these holes or look for these deficiencies in order to fix them. Now, penetration testing can have several different levels, if you will. It can be just a simple vulnerability scan, and pen testers don't take any active place or active aggression against a network or a system, all the way to a full-blown red teaming, scenario-based, situational attack on the organization. But in basic terms, and we get into this more in the CEH material in 4710. We look at the steps in pen testing. We have to identify or verify that a threat exists. To see if there's a bypass of security controls. Actively test those controls against that threat and document it. And that last step with documentation is probably one of the most important that's out there. So some of the major tasks with the reconnaissance piece or the scanning piece of pen testing is to do a vulnerability scan. Now, a lot of pen testers will argue that vulnerability scanning is not really done in pen testing. And you know what? They have a valid complaint there, or a valid observation, because a lot of pen testers never even touch a vulnerability scanner. They will actively enumerate a system or a network with Nmap, and then they will look for weaknesses. They'll look for open ports and then manually test them for weaknesses. And then one of the reasons they do that is scanning can be very, very, very noisy. And this is how a lot of intrusion prevention systems and intrusion detection systems, like we've discussed in previous chapters, work. They see these scans that just hammer a network or hammer a system. They're very easily identifiable. All right, I like to look at this from the physical crime standpoint. If somebody breaks into your house and they come in with a battering ram through your front door, you're going to hear them and see them. But if they come in with lockpicks and other types of quiet tools, they wait for you to be gone, then you don't see them. And, you know, that's kind of a good analogy there. But there are 5 major tasks that we see in vulnerability scanning. Passive testing, and this can be done with just simple tools like a browser or a Wireshark or TCP dump or some sort of sniffer. We can interpret results from our scans to see if what potential, and I want to emphasize that word, potential vulnerabilities there are. Once we've identified those potential vulnerabilities, we then need to look at the control to see if that vulnerability actually exists and test against it. All right? And along with those different controls, we also want to look at common misconfigurations. And you see this in network infrastructure all the time. Simple passwords, default passwords, open telnet sessions, port 80 open instead of port 443, or port 80 being used instead of port 443. A lot of configuration issues that can be put into place on systems and network gear that an attacker can easily take advantage of. So, on the topic of business continuity, and they kind of jump around in this slide deck a little bit, I apologize. But with business continuity, we're looking at the concept of keeping the business open in the event of a disaster or the event of some sort of catastrophic event. And this process is for the implementation of policies, procedures, controls that are going to counteract the effect of that, quote, disaster, end quote. And what we're going to see here is the effect of losses, outages, failures, critical business processes, pretty much anything that could potentially make us lose money or reputation or prestige. Remember, business continuity is not solely relegated to business. Organizations like municipalities, school districts, nonprofits, not-for-profits, they have business continuity operations as well. Okay, case in point, here a while back we had some fires in California around the Getty Museum. Well, you know what? If the Getty Museum would have burned down, there's no more Getty Museum. Nobody's going to come. Nobody's going to come and look at a bunch of ashes. So instead, their business continuity plan that they effected very, very ingeniously, I might say, was to get as much of the art into fireproof vaults on premises, and some of the vaults even went down into the ground within their buildings. Not unlike what the National Archives has with the Declaration of Independence, the Magna Carta, and the Constitution in Washington, D.C. They'll go into this vault, and then after the fire or disaster or whatever hits, they can be revived at a later date and time. So it's not just business from a business perspective. I also want to look at it from a organizational perspective too. So there are critical business functions that have to be revived or have to be looked at. And with businesses, it's typically about, making money. Or with municipalities, for example, public relations outreach to their constituency. So two key components of business continuity planning are business impact analysis and a risk assessment. So the business impact analysis and risk assessment can go hand in hand, where we actually identify everything that is important, that's the business impact, and then we associate risks to all those assets, and we look at the controls or the procedures or policies or whatever to counteract that. Okay, so with a lot of business continuity planning, and here's a big difference. We're going to get into this into the next slide a little bit here. I apologize. Don't get disaster recovery and business continuity planning mixed up. That's a common misconception. Disaster recovery is all about recovery from some sort of one-time or isolated event. Okay? And I always like to use the example of a hard drive failure on a server. Now, if your hard drive is in a RAID array, for example, whether it's a RAID 1 or RAID 5 or RAID 10 or whatever, you have a certain amount of resiliency there. That doesn't mean that a disaster hasn't occurred, right? You've mitigated the business impact with the implementation of the RAID, but in order to fully recover, you still need to replace the disk, right? So here's where we have a little bit of additional minutia with the difference between business continuity and disaster recovery. Both work with backups. Business continuity is more concerned with backups from a standpoint of migration of business function from one locale to another. So you need to understand the difference between the different types of backups, whether it's a partial backup, incremental, or a full backup. And where are they kept? When were they last tested? How do we have a need for immediate backup? Okay. Now, with that, backups are typically done in two methodologies today. They are disk to disk, or they are your traditional tape or cold storage that you can have. And with those tapes, you can migrate that to another location. The problem with disk to disk is most of the time you're moving the data from one disk to another disk, potentially in the same SAN, or if you're lucky, across a local area network or metropolitan area network or wide area network to another location, somewhere off-site. But most of the time when we're talking about disk to disk, that is on-site storage, on-site backups. And then there's a problem with that, especially if we have a natural disaster that occurs. And on-site storage usually refers to that location where the data center is, where the data is, where normal operations occur. So with that disaster recovery, this is the ability to recover something, a switch, a firewall, server, hard drive, an XYZ from a potential disaster. And disaster recovery is usually looked upon on a system-by-system or event-by-event basis. The backups are duplicate copies of information that are ideally stored in a separate location. This is where we do backups to tape. And then we take and we ship those tapes off to some location out of the area. All right. Iron Mountain for years is a good example of that. They still offer those services. Those services are still in practice today by thousands, tens of thousands of companies and organizations throughout the United States and the world, for that matter. So when we have backups, we got to have a backup plan and a disaster recovery plan and a business continuity plan. So all these plans basically roll up into the business continuity plan in some form or fashion. And your disaster recovery plan is going to be very isolated to systems or a specific locale. And it is going to be situational as well. So you could have different disaster recovery plans for different types of situations, whether it's flood, fire, earthquake, natural disaster, man-made disaster, etc. You can write up different situations as to how or where or why you're going to migrate the business or systems if needed. Understanding your backup plan is going to have some issues with it. Okay, and they have to be addressed by your IT department, whether that is in databases. Not all databases back up the same. Not all of them restore the same. And typically, there's a lot of steps involved to restoring data. User files, applications that need to be ready in order to reconstitute the business. You have to look at this from a standpoint of how long is it going to take. So your mean time to recovery, or your MTR, that is very, very, very important because it needs to be communicated to, whoever your key stakeholders are. whether that's shareholders, stockholders, your customer base, your business partners, your employees, all right, and the like. You have to really keep a close, tight eye on this and test it. And that's the biggest problem with business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans. You write them all up, you put them on paper, and then I hope I never have to use it. But what if you do? Well, if you haven't gone through the tests and put emphasis on that, well, in the case of a disaster, it could fall flat. It could fall extremely flat. So, on slide 9 here, these definitions are critical. You see these all the time. They're on multiple tests that I've taken throughout my career, whether it's been the CISSP, CEH, the Security Plus, Cisco test, Microsoft test. You see these definitions in one form or another. So know what a full backup is versus an incremental backup versus a differential backup. A full backup is the easiest one. You back everything up bit for bit on a disk or server to a tape or to another disk or server. Your incremental backup is that which stores only the information that has been changed since the last full backup or the last incremental backup as well. And a differential backup is a backup where files that have been altered since the last full backup, it makes duplicate copies of these files that have been changed since the last differential backup. So basically, what's the difference between differential and backup? It has to do with the archive bit or the archive flag on the hard disk. Incremental backup is anything that has changed. The differential backup was the same thing, but it's also going to reset that archive bit on the disk. Incremental and differential backups are kind of starting to meld together in industry, especially since we're moving more to disk backup. So you're starting to see these kind of be synonymous with one another. But definitely know that a full backup backs up everything, even if it has not changed in the past. So, developing a backup plan. So the book actually does a really good job in kind of architecting this. So they have the grandfather, father, son method, or grandfather, father, child method, if you will. And it's based on the philosophy that a full backup should occur at regular intervals, such as weekly or monthly. A full archival method works along the assumption that any information created on any system is stored forever. We're never going to delete anything. Wow, that can become really expensive. It depends on how big your business is, right? And then the backup server method, which establishes a methodology where a server with large amounts of disk space, whose sole purpose is to back up data. And this is where we get into very large SANs, storage area networks. Okay, Amazon Web Services would call that Glacier, just FYI. Disaster recovery and incident response. So the keys here are going to be with recovering a system and ensuring that it can be recovered, that a backup is available and usable. That is a big problem. That's why you have to test your backups all the time. Then there's the concept of backout versus backup. So backout plans are used more often than not when you're doing change control versus a backup plan, which is basically normal operations. A backout plan, or sometimes referred to as a rollback plan, is how we get back to homeostasis, if you will, or status quo before changes are made. So we also have the concepts of alternate or backup sites, and the differences between a hot site, a warm site, and what they don't have on the slide, a cold site. A hot site, well, actually, let's start with a warm site. A warm site is where we have a data center in another location that has assets readily available for us, but we may have to do some configuration changes or some software updates or something, some piece to get the site ready. Okay, a cold site is basically nothing more than four walls, HVAC, and power. We got to roll everything in and reconfigure everything from scratch. Which is the cold site is the least expensive. The warm site moderately expensive depending on how much you want to put into it, and the hot site is basically where we have a fully functional, ready to go at a milliseconds notice backup site. We have data replication in place. It's off and running, and it's just waiting for the primary site basically to die in order for the hot site to take over. Keeping that into consideration, you have a lot of time and effort and testing and money that goes into creating a hot site. So some of the plans or documentation that goes into business continuity and disaster recovery is an incident response plan. And an incident response plan is going to outline steps that are going to be needed and who needs to be responsible for these steps and how to handle the situation. You can have a master incident response plan, and you can have a lot of sub plans underneath of it based on situations of differing complexity and severities. You need to identify or define what an incident is. It is the occurrence at an event endangering the system, network, or business occurring. And the response encompasses, anything that we need, whether it's forensics, backup, or actually restoration, process of identifying, investigating, repairing, documenting, whatever, in order to get the system normal, right, and basically do a lessons learned to figure out what happened, why it happened, and how we can prevent it from happening again. So the incident response process that the book outlines is pretty straightforward. Identify that, hey, an incident is occurring, and somebody needs to be the master of ceremonies or have the responsibility from a managerial standpoint of saying, hey, I'm declaring an incident. Only a few people have that right, if you will, or that obligation in the organization. Then the investigation of the incident commences. And when that starts, we have to isolate what's wrong, and we start collecting data as to how it went wrong. We have to identify what the damage is done and then start to repair it to get back to status quo, to get back to normal. All the while documenting everything. And then once we declare the incident over or complete, we then go through the forensics process or the analysis process, the lessons learned process, to adjust our procedures, our controls, so that doesn't ever happen again. So forensics in the Security Plus exam is very high level, and they go through a lot of different pieces of the puzzle for forensics. And I'll be the first one to tell you that I am not a forensics person. I know just enough to keep myself out of trouble. But the book has a really good overall scope on page 411 that covers all these different bullet points. All right. So they go over act in order of volatility, where we're basically looking at what's the most critical perspective of this. Capturing system images, documenting network traffic and logs, securing those logs, capturing any video off of a CCTV, taking hashes of passwords and data, any artifacts that are found, record any time offsets if you don't have, say, network time protocol running globally, capture screenshots, talk to witnesses, track man hours and expenses, which of course you need to do because this is a cost burden exercise for any organization. So they also talk a little bit about some tabletop exercises there at the very end, and how to simulate a disaster. I've been involved with these over the course of my career. They're a lot of fun. This is basically where you get to write up a scenario and you take some people through that scenario, and it really makes them think critically as to, well, how would I handle this in my business, or how would I handle this in my job? And it really is an eye-opener for some, without the extent of, say, like a CCDC type event where you are knee-deep into the weeds and you might miss a lot of the big picture because you're knee-deep into the weeds. So to kind of wrap everything up here for the chapter, we covered a lot of the high level of business continuity planning, disaster recovery, forensics. The takeaways here is to understand the aspects of what a disaster is. What does disaster recovery constitute? Know the types of the backups, incremental, differential, full. Be able to discuss and process what a recovery action looks like, what an incident response looks like. Be able to discuss the types of alternative sites, a hot site, warm site, cold site. Be able to describe the components of an incident response policy, what goes into the policy and what gives it its teeth. And understand the basics of forensics that we covered there with all those different definitions. So that wraps everything up here for Chapter 12, for Week 15, and pretty much for the course. I hope you had a very good time, enjoyed the content at least, and learned something or took something away. You have a quiz at the end of this week that covers, I believe, Chapters 10, 11, and 12 of the text. And then the final exam is open at this point in time. You can start on it. It is due by the end of next week. So with that, I'm going to sign off and bid you farewell. This is Professor Brown for 4670. Well, thanks a lot.